really life-altering events that were going on around them. So I felt that it was important, at the very least interesting, to keep them in. And these were the other 7 through 12. That's what I gave you. That's the same thing, right? All the crimes. So you can reference them while I'm talking, although I am going to focus on one. I would also like to point out that in the course of finding all these crimes, I found out that the issues people dealt with then were not really so different from the issues we still deal with today. Included in this book, and I wasn't looking for them, but there they were: mental and behavioral health, understanding disabilities, definitely media influence and its biases, alcoholism, drug addiction and abuse, domestic violence, relationship abuse, adult-child relationships, ethnic biases and attitudes toward immigrants. There was a big influx of immigrants from primarily areas of Europe in this time, and even gun control was a part of the discussion. So all the stories in this book are real people. Those names I did not make up. Those are real people, real places, real events, the dates. All of that is factual information. I do want you to keep in mind that the population in Otter County changed radically in this time period. 1860, they said there were only 240 people here. I don't know how they counted the indigenous people who were here. Maybe they didn't even bother to count them at all. They could be a little itinerant, and given the lack of respect, at least culturally, for indigenous people, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't count them. In 1870, and the first crime you'll recall was in 1871, 1,968 people, and 10 years later, we're talking over 18,000 people. And then by 1890, and that's beyond the scope of this book, that had practically doubled yet again. So this has to have an impact on how people view what's going on when you have an influx of new people. So with all these names, places, dates, completely different circumstances, and with a minimal amount of information in some cases, these were, after all, regular, ordinary people. There wasn't a lot written about them. It wasn't like that I could go to books and there's a book about this family or that family. Mostly there's very little. I needed a way to make you, my readers, just as engaged with this information as I was, and I'm kind of a history freak, research freak too. So I'm going to focus on one crime today, and that's because it has clear ties to the Wadena era. As I mentioned Aldrich, and it has clear ties in the others, and it will help to show my method of handling all these stories with a lot of different people and a lot of different incidences that are not connected. It's not like there was a serial killer out there. These are all separate cases, which I thought made it even more interesting to research. But they are all part of a larger story, the bigger story that culminated in the 13th crime. So my method was to make a mashup of nonfiction, true crime, historical fiction, creative nonfiction, all of those things. I'm wondering if you understand the difference between those. Nonfiction, of course, is factual information. You all, I'm sure, know that. Historical fiction is based on a historical fact, but much of the material, or just even some of the material, might be fictionalized. You might add characters, take characters out, might move dates around, But the fundamental is that it's based on something historically accurate, but the whole book is not. Creative nonfiction is a relatively new genre, and the idea is to treat factual information as if it were fiction, in a sense, to make it a little bit more engaging and readable. And I just mashed them all together. You will know, however, that that is factual, and my commentaries in the book are shown in gray. The gray background is me talking. So there's no question, that's my opinion. I didn't try to pass it off as factual information. And there are many, many quotes in the book from newspapers, from court documents, and whenever I quote, even if it's my creative rendering of court testimony, that material is in quotation marks. However, I did not change material. I did not change facts as I knew them. If I had the facts, I didn't mess around with them. But there were just plain a lot of things I didn't know. Like I said, these were ordinary folks. So, I didn't always know. I embellished. That's what I learned. Did some embellishing. So let me read just a little bit about this first crime, which is number 4, chapter number 4, a feud and offense. There it is. I marked it. I start this chapter with a quote from the Fergus Falls Weekly Journal. In one of the finest tracts of timber country in Ottertail County, not more than 30 rods apart, live W.T. Barnes and W.S. Heathcote. Barnes and Heathcote. Remember those. Here in this lovely forest, shut out from the winds and storms of the prairie, was nursed that fire and blast of hate which has terminated in a tragic, not to say murderous, assault on the 20th day of last month, a feud of years standing, and which had involved in more or less degree nearly all the people of the town of Deer Creek, 10 miles down the road, culminated in the event referred to and which has produced the death of a valuable citizen. End quote. All right, so I start many of these chapters in part 1, which is the 12 murders or the 12 incidences. I start many of those chapters with a little bit of commentary, not every single one, but mostly. So this is me talking. This is an example of commentary. Why exactly W.T. Barnes and W.S. Heathcote nursed that fire and blast of hate is not altogether clear. It had to do with a fence that provided access between their properties, but how this long-standing disagreement became a murderous assault is hard to figure. Even more puzzling is that Barnes and Heathcote's argument had the residents of Deer Creek lining up on one side or another of this fence controversy. Both the victim and the perpetrator nursed the fire, but only one had a weapon when they met late in May on the road near their homes. On the face of it, Heathcote's acquittal for killing Barnes was a simple case of self-defense. Barnes attacked first. The accused claimed that he thought Barnes had a gun. Heathcote had a large club, which he used to beat the victim senseless. With a self-defense plea this flimsy, Heathcote's acquittal must be attributed to other factors. And that's when the case takes on some odd kinks, not the least of which is the inexplicable action taken by Barnes' doctor. And this is a quote from the Fergus Falls Journal. Again, quote, Dr. Crummett, who was from Wadena, the attending physician, calling Dr. Mallory of Perham to his assistance, held a post-mortem examination of the body on the day following the death, notwithstanding that the county attorney had given instructions that in case of Barnes' death, he did not die right away. He lived for several days. An inquest must be held, and the physicians removed and carried away the brain and heart. The postmortem held under the direction of the county coroner was not so satisfactory as it otherwise would have been. Me talking again. The brain and heart that were carried away never turned up again. And Barnes' gun, which Heathcote claimed Barnes had, was never found either. The club, however, that Heathcote had used to beat Barnes was found right where Heathcote had dropped it at the scene of the crime. So that's the crime itself. But what I find really particularly interesting in this story is more the characters who were impacted for life because of this incident. Marcia and Nathaniel Peck, their friendship with Will Barnes, Will Barnes' daughter Lulu, and Nathaniel's son Freddie, and those odd kinks, even with sketchy information at best, both from before the crime and long after its aftermath, you can piece together some understanding of why this particular perpetrator was found not guilty. Can't explain the other ones, but I think we can piece together something about this one. First, a little backstory. This is the chapter we're dealing with, a feud and offense. This picture was taken close to where it doesn't look anything like it did, but close to where Lily's farm was. We'll go back to that. Well, I could show you that. Oops. Now how do I go back?
The arrow on the bottom.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I may go back to that. I can show you where they live.
Okay.
So there's this timeline to give you some idea of why I got so taken with this. I thought, what the heck was going on here? This doesn't make sense to me. In 1858, Marcia knew Will Barnes, possibly in New Hampshire, where was one of the places listed where she lived. I'll tell you this, the census reports are all over the map. I don't know. You can kind of trust them, maybe, sort of, but not reliably. 1860, Nathaniel and Marcia say they were married. She was 18 or 19. He was 21. In 1862, Freddie was born. It's also, I've seen 3 dates for Freddie's birth, 1858, 1860, and 1862. But let's, for now, call it 1862. In 1864, Nathaniel Peck was in the military. Freddie Peck was living with what they say in the census inferred father and mother, Charles and Sarah Peck, in Massachusetts. They later lived in Deer Creek. This is not a brother or sister of Nathaniel Peck, but they must have been related somehow. I can't figure out what that relationship is, but they must have been, because I can't figure out why else they would have ended up in Deer Creek. Nathaniel moved to Deer Creek with Freddie in 1874, and I'm wondering if Barnes had something to do with that move, because they were friends, apparently. Marcia was there by the 1875 territorial census. But did Marcia move there because of Barnes, or did she move there because of Nathaniel? Now, the reason I asked that question is that Marcia Peck testified that she lived most of the time with Will Barnes, kept house, and cared for Will's daughter, Lulu. And she also said in sworn testimony in June of 1878 that she had been married to Nathaniel for 18 years and that Freddie was 18 at that time, which fits, and he was her stepson. So I'm going to read you a couple other selections in here, which will also help you maybe get a feel for how I handled the material. So the reason Marcia Peck figures so significantly into this story is what I'm going to read for you right now. Marcia Peck, Will Barnes' nurse. So Will Barnes was hurt very seriously and was put in the care of this doctor. Dr. Crummett put Will Barnes in the care of Marcia Peck. She could be relied upon to follow his orders, but there was little to be done if he was simply awaiting death. He might be well looked after by the woman who kept his house and cared for his daughter, Lulu. I would call this section a mashup of that would be creative nonfiction right there, because that's a fact. That's based on fact. With the next paragraph, I have no idea what Marcia Peck looked like, so I thought, why not make her interesting? It was hard not to stare at her, though. Marcia Peck was extraordinarily tall. As she towered over many of the men in Deer Creek, were she not wearing a dress, she might have been mistaken for a man, at least from a distance. She had a soft look about her face, which was gentle, with sun-worn lines and two different colored eyes, one hazel and the other yellow-brown. Heterochromial iridium, it's called. I mean, why not? I didn't know what she looked like. She, however, seemed oblivious of her singular appearance or just comfortable. People opened up to her, and why not? She knew the intricacies of everyone's maladies, from Deer Creek to Ottertail and all the way to Wadena, having nursed many of them. That also is probably true. And had never betrayed a patient by passing along even a smidgen of confidential information for time to gossip. That may or may not be true. But I think it's possible, because otherwise she wouldn't have been given the task. She got the task, I presume, because she was a good friend. And she had apparently not been trained as a nurse, but had enough skill to do what she was told by the doctor. I'm sure there weren't a whole lot of options right then. So, in cross-examination testimony, now you can tell that probably A.J. Underwood was writing as fast as he could go, because he didn't write complete sentences. And I'm reading it verbatim, the way it was in the Fergus Falls Journal. I am 36 years old. This is Marcia testifying. I am 36 years old, been married 18 years, knew Barnes 2 years before married, resided in Barnes' house most of the time I have lived in Deer Creek. Now remember, she was married to Nathaniel Peck. Why wasn't she living with him? Was quite friendly. I called him Will. He called me Marcia. He called my stepson, she calls him here, Freddie. His child called me Auntie. Knew Barnes was divorced. Was not a witness in divorce case. Was not with him when he brought his child home. Did not know he took his child by force. Oh, Barnes took his child by force from the mother. Was Marcia his mother? Not. Who was his mother? If it wasn't Marcia, was that Sarah Peck? I don't know. Was the newspaper inaccurate? And who was Lulu's mother, and where was she? Someplace in the Dakotas, as far as we know. So let's return to the crime. Well, Barnes killed by a neighbor. It was the final confrontation, and it would have been a feud of years standing. Heathcote testified that Barnes reached inside of his coat. Heathcote thought Barnes had a gun. No gun was found. Heathcote also testified that he used only his fists, which would have assured him of a manslaughter charge. Having a weapon, which a club was a completely different matter. Barnes had said before he died that Heathcote had used a club, and they found it at the scene of the crime. And Barnes had been seen carrying it earlier in the day. He was on his way to court, district court in Fergus Falls, and he had this pack, like a hobo, he had this packet tied up and hanging over this stick. And someone saw him with it earlier in the day. And more than one person, actually. Questions at all? at the moment. So the case can be made for second-degree murder. You know who convinced the prosecution to charge him with second-degree murder? You're not going to believe this. Nathaniel Peck. So to me, that says Nathaniel, Marcia, and Will Barnes were close. It wasn't unusual for someone who was poor to go live someplace else and care for their household because they didn't have enough money. They needed to do something, right? That wasn't unusual. But the friendship among these three is unusual to say the least. And I think it impacted the decision, and I'm not going to give you all the details because then it's no fun to read this chapter if you want to read the whole chapter. So at the very least, we know that this was a life-altering experience for those people involved. I'm going to give you some of the aftermath. Marcia lived in Aldrich in the 1880 census. This crime occurred in 1878. She listed herself as married at the time and head of household. In other words, she was not living with Nathaniel. And that she was working as a school teacher. Freddie lived with Nathaniel in Deer Creek. And in 1881, Marcia and Nathaniel divorced, and within a few months, Nathaniel had remarried. So the relationship between Marcia and Nathaniel may have been close, they may have been congenial, they may have been good friends, but apparently it wasn't a marriage that could withstand what they had been through. And Lulu, was she returned to her birth mother? No. What did Barnes want for Lulu? It's all in the court testimony. He wanted Lulu to stay with Marcia. And Lulu, who was an 8-year-old girl, wanted to stay with Marcia. Did she? Want to take a guess? Nope. You know where she went? She went to friends of Barnes' family, of Will Barnes, in St. Paul, who she had never met. She was given to this family to raise her and care for her. And as far as we know, she never saw Marcia again. Now, why did that happen? What would happen today? I don't think it would happen like that, right? When you see the details, you can see there's a bigger story, right? There's just a bigger story. And that's just 1 out of 12. And then there's part 2, which is a lot bigger story. So, I think that piecing these together, all these crimes in part 1 that lead up to the death of Lilyfield and the aftermath of that, if I could understand that, I could understand this really pivotal point in Ottertail County's history. And maybe Lilyfield's ghost would just leave me alone. I get this stuff. So why was that? Oh, by the way, there were 5 more unpunished murders after this one. This wasn't the last one. There were 5 more after this one. So why was it called the pig farm murder? Well, this is why. When you look at this quote, this is about the death of Lilyfield. Less than 1 year ago, so this is a report after. By now, you probably know that Nels Holland was the first person hanged in Ottertail County. And it takes all this. The Fergus Hall Journal did a huge story, multi-page story about the whole crime. Less than a year ago, the news reached this city that a bloody and inhuman murder had been committed in the township of St. Olaf, about 18 miles from this city. The details were meager, but they were such a character as to make the blood run cold and cause one to wonder whether such a thing could be done by one in human form. A beautiful young girl left at home by her family on that May morning had been murdered, most likely outraged. No evidence of that. Horribly mutilated, true, thrown into the hog pasture, and her mangled remains partially eaten by the swine. Now that is really inflammatory language, to say the least. No question, it was a horrible crime. There's no question about that. But I think there's a larger question, and I don't think Nels Holong was the monster described here. And I do think there's just a larger question to be asked or answered. So I'm going to read a brief introduction to the beginning of part 2. This is me talking, okay? This is commentary. It's kind of an introduction to this section. The photograph shows a girl with hair parted in the middle and pulled up in a knot, low on her neck, according to the style of the day. She had large dark eyes and the full round face of a young teen. As she aged, her face may have settled into the defined cheekbones and chiseled features of a real beauty. In the vernacular of the day, she might have been considered quite a catch. Certainly not a proper match for an odd Norwegian man twice her age, described as diminutive, of limited intellectual ability, and unremarkable but for his peculiarities. But there's no evidence that anyone who knew him anticipated a capacity for violence, unless it was Lily herself. Reports about the crime strongly suggest she was afraid of him. But why? Had he tried something with her before? Why did she think he was a bad man? Is Nels Holong, her killer, related? What did she know that others did not, or they knew and didn't take seriously? She must have complained to someone. Lily's story is haunting, but not because Lily's specter is floating around the old farmstead. What hangs on is its eerie familiarity. A girl alone with a man is killed. Our inability still today to bring an end to this tragedy is a dark splotch that never fades, no matter how much time passes. Lily may not have feared for her life, but she certainly didn't feel safe. And that should have been enough. Once her little brother left to return a shovel to the neighbors, there was almost no chance that the man's advances, if that's what he had in mind, would be discovered. She did the only thing she had available to her to try and scare him off. She grabbed a knife. No one, including a 15-year-old girl in 1887, pulls a knife on a man unless she feels desperate. Nels Holong may have seemed innocuous to everyone else, but he was a very real threat to her. And that opens the whole story of Lily Field. So, want to go forward. There we go. Okay. So I don't know if any of you have seen the actual documents from this time period. If you go to the Gale Library in the History Center in St. Paul, all the local governments or museums send their original documents. Well, the courthouse in Otter Tail County did. I think the courthouses in all the counties do this, right? And they send them down here to be stored so that they are preserved properly. You can go there, you can sign a little piece of paper, you can ask them for documents. They go downstairs, they get them, they bring them to you, to your table. You bring them back. But there you are with your hands on the actual documents. I didn't have all of them for all of these crimes, but I did have these. And that's what the cover of the indictment looked like. This was what we would call the indictment now. And it describes what happened. And you can see it's handwritten. Everything was, of course, handwritten at the time. But it describes what happened briefly. The date, it's all signed. This is the signed document that the jury handed to the judge after their deliberations, saying that this man was guilty. It was the first one where a jury actually found the perpetrator in a murder guilty. It took them about 15 minutes, if you can imagine, making a decision about a case like this. The trial itself was less than 2 days, 2 full days. Okay, not that. And this is the sentencing document, and it's so chilling I'm not even going to read it to you. But can you read it? Can you see it? Can you see it now? A little bit of it. It's hard to read.
Especially the last line.
It's pretty chilling.
Yeah.
I mean, you can read the last line, and that's kind of tells the story. Do you know how many hangings there were, legal hangings in Ottawa County total in its history? Anybody?
Just that one?
2. Ever. And the rules about capital punishment changed all over the place from when the county was under territorial government, and then in 1858, Minnesota became a state, and it was the same year Ottawa County became an organized county, although it was not all that organized quite yet, had a ways to go. But the rules about capital punishment changed a lot. And it was very interesting that in the case of Nels Holong, this is one of the ways that this case kind of fell through the cracks, honestly.
Is he a hired hand or a neighbor?
He was a hired hand. And he was, I can connect the dots for you shortly. But thanks for asking. So here's a picture that was in the journal of Nels Holong. I came up with a pretty different picture of Nels Holong, of Lily and her end of the system of justice as it was understood in the late 1800s. I have to say that in the course of researching this book, I found that people were not, I don't think, any better or worse than we are right now. They just had a different understanding of how justice worked. And they had, in some cases, not a very good understanding of the things that, you remember the issues I put up? A person with disabilities and how to handle the responsibility of someone who's an alcoholic, and in terms of how that relates to a crime. I mean, all these things that we have sort of codified, if you will, were not entirely back then, and we're changing, morphing a lot. And the counties farther out from the center of government, which was St. Paul, were, I think, a little bit looser than the ones who were closer in and more accessible. So there were just a couple more things that impacted the decision in the Marsha Peck case that I just want to throw in there because I think it had an impact. One is that Heathcote apparently had a little side business selling illegal liquor. Friends and neighbors. And it was illegal because he was supposed to be paying for a license and paying some kind of a tax, I think, but at least paying for a license, and he wouldn't do it. And he was indicted for not I gotta show you that. He was indicted because it's an amazing document. He was indicted. Here's the indictment. There's the cover. That's the cover of it. So it would have been this big. But he was indicted for selling spirituous liquors in a less quantity than 5 gallons without first obtaining a license. So that was one thing. People wanted to keep their source of hooch safe, I would think. Another thing is he had representing him a man named Bill Irwin. Ever heard of Bill Irwin? At the time, Bill Irwin was a rising star as a litigator. He made an appearance later in Otter Tail County, but he had already developed a reputation in the Twin Cities as a litigator. And he was such an orator and had such charisma that I think Otter Tail County residents were kind of flattered that they got to go to court and listen to this man who was really amazing. He was kind of a rock star lawyer. And that's who Heathcote got to represent him. Did that impact the jury's decision? Holon didn't have Bill Irwin. He had a family friend, and he had a court-appointed attorney who really didn't care particularly about Holon, and that's another story. So I want to give you one last parting thought before I just open it up and let you ask whatever questions you like. I do have a loose connection to this story, not much of one, but it kind of hit me when I figured it out. I am not in any way related to Lilyfield, her family. I have no other connection to Lilyfield. However, Nels Holon, and that would have been those diacritical marks, the A with a little circle over it, rather than an O, but that's the Americanized version, was a Norwegian Lutheran from Decorah, Iowa. My family has deep connections to Decorah, Iowa, and they were Norwegian Lutheran ministers. Nels Holon's family were instrumental in setting up a parish right outside of Decorah called Madison Lutheran Church. It still exists today. And Holon's parents were fairly prosperous farmers. And they were very instrumental in getting that congregation set up with so few Norwegians in the mid-19th century and so few Norwegian Lutheran pastors. And my ancestor, Herman Amber Preus, my great-great-grandfather, was one of the people who established the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And Madison Lutheran Church was one of those congregations. And he was also instrumental in establishing Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. And that was 1861. And my great-great-grandfather was a student there in the 1870s. You can't tell me their paths didn't cross somehow. They just must have. Not that there's a record that I can find. I probably should go to Madison Lutheran Church and dig in their archives, but I think what I'm going to find are births, deaths, confirmations, weddings. That's what they keep track of, and they're very good at it. So that's my only connection with him. I will say that I learned a lot about these people. I learned a lot about this time period. I just think that the lives of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, it's just always a good story. And that's what I always write about in all the things that I write, really. So why was Nels Holon the first one to be punished? You'll just have to read the book. I guess. So, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to leave you with a quote. A, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. That's a good one, huh? From Marcus Garvey. So, anybody like to ask questions? I'd be happy to answer anything you might have. Or if you have a comment.
Through all your research, and since then, have you looked into crimes in Lauderdale County since then?
After the 1888, I did while I was doing my research. And I decided I couldn't do them all. And what interested me about this was that why were all those people not punished? Only this guy was. And so that seemed the proper place to stop. But I did find other ones, yes, that followed this one. And I did at one time know a little bit about them. I've kind of taken them out of my hard drive up here to just keep track of these. But yeah, there are some interesting ones. Do you know something about those?
No, but just wondering, is that going to be a sequel?
I have to tell you, it has crossed my mind to write a book, a little book, a small book, called How I Wrote a Book with a Ghost. And it has to do, because at one time, this book was a co-write with Lily and with the founder of Fergus Falls. It was a crazy idea. My sister, who's an author, said, "Don't do this. It's just you're going too far afield." And I was having a heck of a good time writing it. Honestly, it was really having fun. So I thought, well, okay, tends to be a little bit of a heavy book, although there's some humor in it. There's definitely some humor in it. I'll write a lighter book about how I wrote a book with a ghost from that time period. And it was a man, and he and I didn't see eye to eye about so many things. And we could have all these interesting conversations. And I have enough material. I could put that together, but I haven't done it yet. Well, thanks for the encouragement. Maybe I will sometime. Anyone else?
That Heathcote Barnes case, who cut his heart out and his brain out and why?
That is one of the things I cannot answer, but I brought it up because exactly, that was a young doctor. He was about 32 years old. His name was Cromit, and he lived in Wadena. And why he was brought over and by whom? It couldn't have been the county because they said specifically, there will not be a postmortem unless we do it, and then somebody did it anyway. I suspect it was Nathaniel Peck and Marshall Lawrence. Marshall Peck. And why he took them away, he said to examine them. But actually, the evidence suggests, I looked at the testimony again, and the evidence suggests that Barnes did not die that had anything to do with his heart or his brain. It had to do with his lungs. He was beaten with this club and ribs were cracked. Could very well have pierced his lungs. Fluid buildup, then infection. We know about these things now, and we know what to do with them. But they didn't have the means to even do an X-ray and figure out what was going on in there. So it was undoubtedly, from the evidence that I read, that's why he died. It's just that's part of the frustration of doing the research in this time period. There are just some things you can't know. And that's why I kept researching for such a long time. Because you keep saying, I can find it. Now sometimes you can't. I'm sure there's more research that I could come over to your historical society here and spend a lot of time here and find some more information, I'm sure. Yeah. Any other comments?
So we got a preview of the conclusion of your investigation into Lilyfield's murder, and that Nels probably wasn't the murderer. That's what we're getting right here. Do you on your
Okay,
research?
correct that, but go ahead.
Okay, on your research, do you have an alternate suspect and that you named, and have a pretty good notion that that person actually did do it?
I honestly, I don't mind telling you, I think Nels did it. He confessed and he described it. And if he would have just kept his mouth shut, they wouldn't have had much of anything on him.
Mm-hmm.
But he told them everything to the best of his abilities. My question was, why did he tell them? Why did he do it? I do not think it was premeditated. I do not believe it was first degree, and I do not believe he should have hanged. I don't mind telling. There's so much more to explain that I don't mind telling you that. But there's very compelling evidence to me today, as a person living in today's environment, that it just should not have happened the way it did.
Spoiler alert, but that kind of sounds like the end of Mice and Men. Just maybe that was the situation. I don't know. That just kind of reminds me of Mice and Men. Yeah. So, all right. But anyway. All right. Were there any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for coming. You're attentive. I could see it in your faces. It's great. Thank you.
You mentioned your sister is an author. Is that somebody we have heard of? I'm thinking
Janet Preus.
You know what? I got a question about that from.
She got a bunch of books.
Yes, she has
a lot of middle grade fiction.
She has been here to speak in the last 12 months.
Oh, really?
She has. I didn't.
I can't keep track of where she goes. I mean, she's going all the time.
An award-winning young adult and junior author. Oh yeah, we can end the.
Yeah, she is.
The stream.
And she's got children's books and middle grade fiction mostly, but even her middle grade fiction is interesting for adults. It really is. And she does a lot of historical fiction. Actually, she's gone all over the world doing research